Knox Aldridge had never trembled, not when he sat across from men who wanted to take him down. Not when he made the kind of decisions that silenced an entire city. People spoke his name in whispers, because everyone understood Knox Aldridge was not a man you challenged. But tonight, he stood before a cracked, peeling door on the 4th floor of a cheap apartment building, and his hands were shaking. The door opened. A girl stood inside, thin, dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep, still wearing her diner apron. She looked at Knox, looked at his expensive suit, looked at the 2 bodyguards standing in the hallway, then blocked the doorway. "I need to see the person inside this apartment," Knox said. "There's no one here but me." A lie. Knox knew it. But this girl, a waitress who didn't have $200 in her bank account, was staring straight into the eyes of the most powerful man in the city without blinking. Knox lowered his voice. "Her name is Maggie. She used to sing me to sleep every rainy night. I've been looking for her for 20 years. The girl didn't move, but something shifted behind her eyes. Then, from inside the apartment, a trembling voice called out, "Is someone at the door?" Knox froze. That voice older, weaker, thinner, but he recognized it instantly. That voice had read stories to him, had sung him to sleep, had whispered, "It's okay," every time the thunder rolled. The girl looked at Knox. Then she stepped aside. Knox crossed the threshold. At the far end of the room, on a small bed, pressed against the wall, an old woman with white hair, so thin the blanket lay almost flat, sat leaning against the wall, eyes fixed on the doorway. Knox spoke 3 words. His voice cracked. "Maggie, I'm afraid of thunder." The old woman burst into tears. Her trembling hands reached toward him. Knox walked over and sat down beside the bed. Her hands were small, cold, nothing but bone. His hands were large, warm, and shaking. Maggie pulled his head to her chest and held on tight. The girl stood in the corner of the room. She didn't fully understand what was happening. She only knew one thing: Maggie, the woman she had shared her bread with for 4 months on a park bench, was not a confused old lady telling made-up stories. And the man burying his face in her shoulder was the little boy from those stories. 4 months ago, no one in this room knew each other. This is the story of how they found one another. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what comes next, because sometimes the right story at the right time can change the way you see life. 4 months earlier, Josie Whitfield woke up at 4:30 in the morning. She didn't need an alarm. Her body had grown so used to being deprived of sleep that it knew on its own when it had to rise. She washed her face with cold water, drank half a cup of coffee left over from yesterday, slung her bag over her shoulder, and stepped out of the apartment before the sky had time to brighten. The elevator had been broken since the month before. 4 flights of stairs. Her thin sandals tapped out an even rhythm on the concrete steps. This was how Josie began every day. The morning shift at the diner started at 6 o'clock. The night shift cleaning offices ended at 12 o'clock. Between the 2 shifts, she had just enough time to go home, look at the stack of overdue bills on the kitchen shelf, and then leave again. Josie didn't complain. She didn't have time to complain. She also didn't have anyone to complain to. Her parents had died when she was 18, leaving behind her and Wesley, her younger brother, who was only 12 at the time. Josie raised him with nothing but her bare hands, with every job she could possibly take, until Wesley was old enough and bright enough to earn a college scholarship and walk forward on his own. Now, Wesley was gone. The apartment held only her, but Josie still lived as though she were taking care of someone, because she'd never learned how to live for herself. The road from the apartment building to the diner took about 20 minutes on foot. Josie didn't take the bus because $1.50 each way, multiplied by 2 rides a day, multiplied by 30 days, became a number she didn't dare calculate. Walking was free, and walking had one other advantage. The shortcut through Redmond Park was 5 minutes shorter than going around by the main road. Redmond Park wasn't the kind of park people saw in movies. The grass was yellowing, the stone benches were old, and a few large oak trees cast shade. No one came to sit beneath because that area had nothing except an abandoned bus stop and several trash cans that hadn't been emptied in a long time. Josie crossed through the park every morning at 5:15, when the world was still dim, when the streets were still empty, when the whole city was still asleep. And every morning, she saw that old woman. The woman sat on the same stone bench, in the same posture, back straight, both hands folded neatly in her lap. Her clothes were old but clean, as though she washed them somewhere every night, even though she had no home. She didn't stretch out across the bench like the other homeless people in the park. She sat, upright, still, as though she were waiting for someone, or as though she refused to let anyone see her in a posture of surrender. Josie walked past her every morning for 2 straight weeks. 14 times. 14 times, she looked over, then looked away, then kept walking. She told herself she didn't have enough strength. She didn't earn enough to feed herself. So how could she help anyone else? She told herself this city was full of suffering people, and she couldn't stop for every single one. But every morning she passed by, she looked again. And every time she looked, she saw the same thing. That old woman was hungry. Josie knew what a hungry body looked like, because she had seen it in the mirror for years. Collarbones jutting out, skin hollowed beneath the cheekbones, eyes still bright but sunken deep. That old woman was hungry, but she still sat with her back straight. She still folded her hands in her lap. She still held herself the way people do when they've lost every single thing except one last thing: dignity. Josie recognized it because she lived exactly the same way. She was hungry too, but she never let anyone see that she was hungry. She was exhausted too, but she never sat down in the middle of the road. She had lost everything too, but she never bowed her head. And maybe that was why, on the 15th day, Josie didn't walk past. She stopped. That morning, Josie stopped at the bakery on the corner before entering the park. She counted the crumpled tip money in her coat pocket, just enough for one warm loaf of bread. She held the loaf wrapped in brown paper, the heat seeping through into her palm, then continued down the familiar path. The old woman was still sitting there, the same stone bench, the same straight-backed posture, hands folded neatly. Josie didn't walk past. She turned in, walked to the bench, and sat down beside her. She said nothing. She didn't look over. She tore the loaf of bread in half, placed one half on the bench between them, then took the first bite from her own piece. She chewed slowly, staring straight ahead, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. The old woman didn't move, her eyes lowered to the half loaf on the bench, then shifted toward Josie as she chewed. A few seconds passed, then a few more. Josie kept eating, still not looking over, still not speaking. She understood something many people didn't, that giving food to someone who was hungry could also wound them if it came with eyes full of pity. So she didn't give it to her. She ate with her. The old woman looked at the half loaf for another moment. Then she picked it up, broke off a small piece, and put it into her mouth. No thank you. No refusal. No asking why. The two of them sat side by side on a stone bench in an empty park, sharing one warm loaf of bread at 5:15 in the morning, and neither one said a single word. The next day, Josie had no tip money. She still passed through the park, sat down beside the old woman for 5 minutes before going to work. She brought nothing. She only sat. The old woman didn't say anything either. But when Josie stood up to leave, the woman watched her longer than usual. The day after that, Josie had tip money again. She bought another warm loaf of bread, tore it in half again, set one half on the bench again, ate with her again in silence. It went on like that, 3 or 4 times a week, depending on the days when customers left extra money at the diner. Josie didn't think of it as charity. She thought of it as breakfast. She had to eat breakfast anyway, and whether she ate alone or ate with someone else, the loaf would still be torn in half. She changed only one thing. She tore half for another person, instead of eating the whole loaf herself. By the second week, the old woman spoke first. Her voice was low, a little hoarse, but every word was clear. "You work at the diner on Maple Street, don't you?" Josie turned toward her, slightly surprised. "How do you know?" "Apron. The diner's name is printed in the corner." Josie looked down at the apron she'd forgotten to take off and let out a soft laugh. Josie. Maggie. That was all. No handshake. No more questions. No life stories. 2 names exchanged between 2 pieces of bread. From then on, they talked. Not much. A few sentences each morning, scattered like puzzle pieces that hadn't yet found their shape. Josie told her she worked 2 shifts, that the night shift was harder than the morning shift because she had to mop office floors alone in an empty building. Maggie asked whether she slept enough. Josie said enough, and both of them knew it was a lie. Maggie didn't tell anything about herself. She asked more than she spoke. She asked whether the diner was busy, whether anyone treated Josie badly. whether Josie ever got a day off. Small questions, gentle questions. But Josie realized something. It had been a very long time since anyone had asked her things like that. It had been a very long time since anyone had cared whether she was getting enough sleep. Some mornings, the two of them said nothing. Josie sat down, tore the bread, ate, then left. Maggie took her half, ate, then watched her go. That was all. And that was enough. The relationship between them didn't begin with words. It began with half a loaf of bread placed on a stone bench, with a silence that didn't need to be filled, with two women sitting beside each other every morning without needing to explain why. Josie didn't ask Maggie where she came from, why she lived in the park, where her family was. She didn't ask because she knew what it felt like to be asked questions she didn't want to answer. And Maggie didn't ask Josie why a young woman lived alone, why her eyes always looked tired, why she tore bread for a stranger, when she herself didn't have anything to spare. Both women kept their stories to themselves. But every morning, they still sat beside each other, and the loaf of bread was still torn in half. In the 4th week, Josie came to the park earlier than usual. The sky wasn't fully light yet. Dew still clung to the grass, and she heard a strange sound coming from the direction of the stone bench. Singing, very soft, almost blended into the morning wind, but Josie heard it clearly, because the park was so empty. Maggie was singing. She sat there, eyes closed, head slightly tilted, her mouth moving with a melody Josie had never heard before. It wasn't a song from the radio. It wasn't church music. It was a lullaby. Her voice trembled, slipping a little out of rhythm on the higher notes. But the melody was clear, as though she had sung that song thousands of times until it had soaked into her bones. Josie stopped a few steps from the bench, not wanting to interrupt. She stood there listening until Maggie stopped singing, opened her eyes, and saw her. The old woman didn't look embarrassed. She simply looked at Josie as though she were someone who had arrived at exactly the right moment. Josie sat down, tore the loaf of bread the way she always did, and placed half on the bench. The two of them ate in silence for a while. Then Josie asked, her voice gentle, not pressing, "Who did you used to sing for?" Maggie stopped chewing. Her eyes looked far away, past the rows of trees, past the road, past something Josie couldn't see. The silence stretched so long that Josie thought she wouldn't answer. Then Maggie said, her voice lower than usual, "For a child. A very long time ago." Josie didn't ask anything more, but from that morning on, whenever Josie asked one small question, Maggie released a piece of memory. Never the whole story. Only fragments, scattered and loose, without a beginning or an end, like pages torn from a novel Josie wasn't allowed to read. "That boy was afraid of thunder," Maggie said one gloomy morning. "Every time it rained, he would crawl under the blanket, and I had to sit beside him and sing until he fell asleep. Sometimes I sang until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Another morning," she said, "that house had 12 bedrooms, but the boy only liked sleeping in my room. He said my room was the smallest, but the warmest." Josie listened and didn't comment. She thought Maggie was remembering a grandchild, maybe a grandson, maybe the child of someone she had once cared for. A house with 12 bedrooms sounded too large, so perhaps Maggie was remembering it wrong, or perhaps old memory had a way of enlarging the things that belonged to the past. Josie didn't correct her, didn't ask again, didn't look doubtful. She only listened, because she understood that sometimes people told stories not so others would believe them, but so they themselves could remember that they had once lived another life. At the same time, on the other side of the city, a meeting ended in silence. Not ordinary silence, the kind of silence that falls when 12 men sit around a long wooden table in a sealed room and no one dares to breathe too loudly. Knox Aldridge sat at the head of the table. He had just finished speaking, and that sentence hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder after an explosion. A subordinate had been caught skimming money from one of the family's business operations. Not much, but Knox wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the whole room. "I don't care about the amount," he said, his voice as calm as if he were reading a menu. "I care about the nod. When I asked if everything was fine, and you nodded, you lied to me in front of everyone here. You thought I didn't know. That's the problem." Then Knox turned to the man, still in that weightless voice. "You have 24 hours to leave the city. If I see your face after that, I won't have this conversation a second time." The man stood and walked out of the room. He didn't say a word back. The door closed. Knox took a sip of water and set the glass down. Continue. The meeting went on as though nothing had happened. After the meeting, Knox remained seated alone. Tate walked in and placed a brown envelope on the desk. The monthly report. Knox didn't need to open it to know what was inside. The same content as every month, the same conclusion, not found. He looked at the envelope, then at Tate. Keep looking. Tate stood still for one beat. It seemed as though he wanted to say something, but then Tate looked into Knox's eyes, and whatever words had been sitting on the tip of his tongue fell back down his throat. Yes, sir. Tate went out and closed the door. Knox stayed seated in the empty room. He opened the drawer of his desk and took out an old photograph, its edges yellowed with age. In the picture, a little boy sat on the lap of a brown-haired woman, and both of them were laughing. The boy's smile was wide and toothy, missing one front tooth. The woman's smile was warm, her eyes narrowed because she was laughing so much. Knox looked at the photograph, for a long time, without expression. His face was still as night water, but his hand gripped the drawer key so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Then he put the photo back inside, locked the drawer, stood, and walked out of the room. No one in Knox's organization knew about that photograph. No one knew he opened that drawer once every month, on the exact day the report was sent in. And no one knew that the man the whole city feared, the man no one dared to look straight in the eye, sat alone every month in a locked room and looked at the picture of a nanny who had disappeared when he was still young. The call came at 9 o'clock at night, just as Josie had begun her office cleaning shift. Wesley's name lit up on her phone screen. She answered, tucking the phone between her shoulder and her ear, while her hand was still wringing out the cleaning rag. Sis, I need to buy textbooks for the new semester. The professor said I can't get into class without the books. Wesley's voice was hesitant, the kind of hesitation that belonged to a younger brother who knew his sister didn't have money to spare, but had no other way out. Josie asked how much. Wesley gave her a number. She didn't remember exactly what that number was, only that it was bigger than the amount in her bank account. I'll transfer it to you tomorrow, Josie said, her voice normal, as if this wasn't something worth worrying about. She hung up and opened the banking app on her phone. $38. She stared at that number for a long time, then turned off the screen and kept mopping the floor. That night, when she got home, Josie opened her closet. She didn't own much. A few sets of work clothes, several old t-shirts, and one winter coat hanging in the farthest corner. The coat was dark blue, the fur collar worn down, the zipper slightly stuck in the middle. It was the only thing her mother had left behind. Not because her mother hadn't owned anything else, but because after the accident, after the funeral, after the insurance money paid off the debts and the rent swallowed what was left, this coat was the only thing no one demanded, no one took, and no one cared enough to carry away. Josie had kept it for 9 years. She lifted the coat to her nose, closed her eyes, and breathed in. Her mother's scent wasn't there anymore. It had been gone for a long time. All that remained was the smell of old fabric and damp wooden closet walls. But Josie still did it every time she held the coat. Like a habit her body refused to abandon even when her mind knew perfectly well it was meaningless. She folded the coat neatly, placed it in a cloth bag, and the next morning brought it to the thrift shop on her way to the diner. The shop owner turned the coat over a few times, tested the zipper, checked the seams. $70. Josie nodded. She took the money and divided it, part for Wesley, part to buy Maggie's heart medication at the pharmacy near the park. When she stepped out of the thrift shop, Josie was half a kilo lighter because the coat was no longer in her hands. But she was heavier somewhere else, somewhere she couldn't name. She walked straight to the diner without looking back. That same week, everything else came down too. On Wednesday night, Josie came home from her night shift close to 12 o'clock. Passing a dark stretch of road near her apartment building, she reached into her pocket for her keys and realized her wallet wasn't there. She stopped and searched every pocket of her coat, her pants, her bag. Nothing. The wallet was gone, and inside it was all the tip money from the entire day. $47. Josie stood in the middle of the sidewalk, staring down at her empty hands. Then she sank down onto the front steps of a closed store. She didn't cry. She only sat there and let out one long, very long breath, as though she were trying to push out everything that was pressing down on her chest. Then she stood up, brushed off her pants, and went home. On Thursday, the bathroom pipe broke. Water leaked out slowly but steadily, dripping onto the floor without stopping. Josie called the landlord. The landlord said he would send someone to take a look. No one came. Josie called again. The landlord said next week. Josie understood that next week meant never. She put a plastic bucket under the leak, and every few hours she emptied it once. On Friday, Josie went in for her morning shift. Darlene, the co-worker, almost 20 years older than her, the one who managed the morning shift at the diner, looked Josie up and down when she walked into the kitchen. She didn't say anything, but Josie knew Darlene was looking because she saw that look, the look of a woman who had lived long enough to know when a girl was hungry and pretending she wasn't. Darlene didn't ask. She didn't push. She didn't say things like, "You need to eat," or "You're getting too thin." Darlene didn't do that because she understood something few people understood, that forcing someone who was trying to keep her dignity to admit she was suffering was also a way of stripping away the last thing she had. So Darlene chose another way. At the end of the shift, when Josie was getting ready to leave, Darlene set 2 containers of food on the counter. "Would be a waste to throw it out," Darlene said, not looking at Josie. "You taking it home, or am I dumping it?" Josie looked at the 2 containers of food. She knew Darlene had cooked extra on purpose. She knew that food wasn't leftovers. But she also knew that if she said it out loud, Darlene would have to admit it, and both of them would have to stand there facing a truth neither one wanted to put into words. So Josie simply picked up the 2 containers, said, "Thank you," and walked away. That evening, she brought 1 container to Maggie in the park. The other one she ate on the way home, standing on a street corner, eating while watching cars pass by. It was the only meal she had that day. That night, the rain came down. Not a light, steady drizzle, but a violent downpour. Heavy drops striking the pavement as if they meant to punch holes through the sidewalk. Josie finished her office cleaning shift at 12:15, and when she stepped out of the building, the water had already risen to her ankles. She pulled her hood over her head, bent forward, and rushed into the rain. The road home through Redmond Park was pitch black. The streetlights in that part of town had been broken for who knew how long, and no one had bothered to fix them. Josie had to walk by memory, counting each step along the narrow path her feet knew by heart after hundreds of crossings. She passed the familiar stone bench. Empty. Josie stopped. Maggie wasn't there. Every night, when Josie came home late from work and cut through the park, she saw Maggie lying on that stone bench, wrapped in her thin blanket, asleep or pretending to be asleep. But tonight the bench was empty. The blanket was gone, and Maggie's bag was still sitting beneath the bench. But Maggie herself was not. Josie looked around. The rain was too heavy, and she could only see a few meters ahead. She called out, "Maggie?" No one answered. She called again, louder this time. The wind swallowed her voice. Then she saw it. Beneath the large oak tree, about 10 steps from the bench, a human figure lay curled on the ground. Josie ran to her. Maggie was lying on her side, both hands pressed to her chest, her clothes soaked through and clinging tightly to her body, her lips bluish, her eyes closed. Josie dropped to her knees and shook her shoulder. "Maggie, Maggie, can you hear me?" Maggie opened her eyes, slowly, with difficulty. Her gaze was clouded, and it took a few seconds before she recognized Josie. She was gasping for breath, each inhale short and shallow, her hand still clutching her chest as though she were trying to keep something inside from breaking apart. Josie pulled out her phone and dialed emergency services. But before she could press call, Maggie's hand grabbed her wrist, held it tight, so tight that Josie startled, because she hadn't thought a frail old woman like that could still have such strength in her grip. "No." Maggie's voice was rough, but clear. "No hospital." Josie stared at her, rain streaming down both their faces. "You need a doctor." "No hospital," Maggie repeated, her eyes opening wider, and Josie saw something in them that sent a chill down her spine. Fear. Not the fear of a sick person afraid of hospitals. Not the fear of an old woman afraid of needles or of lying alone in a white room. This was another kind of fear. The fear of an animal that had been hiding for a very long time and knew one mistake was all it would take to be found. "They'll ask for papers," Maggie said, her voice shaking from cold or from fear. Josie couldn't tell which. "They'll find me." Josie didn't understand. She didn't know who they were. She didn't know what Maggie was running from. But she looked into those eyes and understood something she didn't need anyone to explain. That Maggie would rather die under the rain than let someone know where she was. Josie turned off the phone and shoved it into her pocket. "Hold on to me." She slipped her arm behind Maggie's back and pulled her up. Maggie was so light it frightened Josie. Light as if there were nothing inside her body but bones and fear. She helped her stand, draped Maggie's arm over her own shoulder, and began walking. From the park to the apartment building was a 10-minute walk. Then came 4 flights of stairs. Josie helped Maggie up 1 step at a time. Maggie slipped on the 2nd floor, and Josie held on tight. The 2 of them nearly fell, but they didn't. Maggie coughed on the 3rd floor, a dry, hollow cough that sounded like wind passing through a cracked flute. Josie tightened her grip. We're almost there. Just 1 more floor. At the apartment door, Josie unlocked it with 1 hand, while still holding Maggie with the other. She brought her inside, laid her on the only bed, and pulled the blanket over her body. Maggie's clothes were soaked through. Josie took out an old pair of her own pajamas, helped Maggie change, then added a 2nd blanket over the first. She turned on the stove and cooked porridge with the last handful of rice left in the jar. While waiting for it to boil, she sat beside the bed, pressing a hand to Maggie's forehead to check her temperature. Hot. She got a wet cloth and laid it across Maggie's brow. Then she sat there. All night. She didn't sleep. She watched Maggie breathe, counted each breath, and whenever the rhythm slowed or quickened strangely, she placed a hand on Maggie's chest to make sure her heart was still beating. Josie wasn't a doctor. She didn't know what illness Maggie had. She didn't know whether plain porridge would help. She didn't know whether putting a wet cloth on her forehead was the right thing to do. She only knew how to do the things she had once done when Wesley was sick as a child, when there was no money for the hospital, when the 2 of them had only each other in an empty apartment. Near dawn, Maggie fully woke. Her eyes opened, clearer now, and she saw Josie sitting beside the bed, dark circles beneath her eyes from staying awake all night, her hand still resting on the edge of the blanket. Maggie looked around the room. Then she looked back at Josie. Her eyes slowly reddened, then filled with tears. "Why did you help me?" Her voice caught. "You don't know who I am." Josie looked at her. She thought of so many things she could say. She thought about explaining that she had once been orphaned, had once lain sick all alone, had once known what it felt like when no one came. But she didn't say those things. She only said, "I don't need to know who you are. You needed help. That's enough," Maggie cried. Not with sobs. Tears slid silently down her wrinkled cheeks, soaked into the pillow, and she held Josie's hand tightly, as though gripping a life raft in the middle of the sea. From that night on, Maggie didn't return to the park. She stayed in Josie's apartment. The only bed was given to her. Josie spread a thin blanket on the floor, curled herself up, and fell asleep just as the sky began to brighten, managing to get 2 hours before the alarm rang and a new day began. Maggie recovered slowly, but steadily. In the first days, she only lay there, sleeping more than waking, sometimes giving a few dry coughs before sinking back into sleep again. Josie worked the morning shift, came home to check on her, then went on to the night shift. Every time she came back, the first thing she looked at was Maggie's chest, to see whether it was still rising and falling. Only then did she breathe out. Only then did she take off her shoes. Only then did she begin living the remaining part of her evening. After about 2 weeks, Maggie was able to sit up. She began moving around the apartment in short, slow steps, one hand braced against the wall. She went to the bathroom by herself, poured her own water, folded the blankets herself every morning. She wasn't the kind of person who accepted lying still while someone else served her, and Josie realized that very early. Even when Maggie was so weak that standing up required her to stop halfway and rest, she still tried to do everything she could on her own. The dignity she had carried on the stone bench in the park, she carried into this apartment too. One weekend evening, Josie came home after a chain of days when she could no longer remember how many hours she had slept. The morning shift at Darlene's diner, the night shift cleaning offices, then the morning shift again, then the night shift again, the days following one another into one blurred streak without borders. She opened the door, stepped inside, dropped her bag on the floor, sat down in the only chair beside the dining table, and stared into the empty space in front of her. She didn't turn on the kitchen light. She didn't open the refrigerator. She only sat there, both hands resting on the table, eyes looking straight ahead while seeing nothing at all. The way a person sits when she has reached her limit and doesn't know whom to tell. Maggie stood in the bedroom doorway, looking at Josie. She didn't ask what had happened today. She didn't ask if Josie was all right. She didn't ask why her face was so pale. She only looked, then turned around and walked into the kitchen. Josie heard the sound of running water. the sound of the gas stove clicking on, the sound of an instant noodle packet being torn open, the sound of an egg tapping against the edge of a bowl, the sound of scallions being cut on a small chopping board, the knife striking wood in a steady rhythm. Small, ordinary sounds, but in the silent apartment close to midnight, they sounded like a lullaby. A few minutes later, Maggie came out. In her hands was a plate of instant noodles, not the kind of noodles someone ate in a hurry straight from the pot with a simple fork, but noodles arranged on a clean plate, the strands set neatly, with a few thin slices of green onion scattered over the top, and a fried egg whose yolk was still soft and damp in the center. It was the plate of noodles made by someone who knew how to cook, the plate of noodles made by someone who had once cooked for someone else, with all the care in the world. Maggie placed the plate in front of Josie. "Eat. Tonight, I cooked." Josie looked at the plate of noodles. She didn't look at Maggie. She looked at the plate, at the neatly arranged slices of green onion, at the perfectly round fried egg, and her throat tightened. She couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for her. Maybe it had been her mother. Maybe it had been 9 years ago, or longer. Since her mother died, Josie had been the one who cooked. Cooked for Wesley. Cooked for herself. Cooked for Maggie. It was always her standing at the stove. Always her bringing food out. Always her taking care of someone. No one had ever carried a plate of food to her and set it down in front of her and said, "Eat." Never. Josie picked up the fork, took the first bite, then the second. She ate slowly, eyes lowered to the plate, and she said nothing, because she knew that if she opened her mouth now, what came out wouldn't be words. Maggie sat down in the chair across from her. She didn't eat. She only sat there, both hands folded neatly in her lap, watching Josie eat, and smiled. A small smile. Soft, warm, the smile of someone who had once raised a child into adulthood, and knew that sometimes the only thing that needed to be done was to cook a bowl of noodles and sit there watching someone eat. While Josie was splitting bread and watching over an old woman's sleep in a 4th-floor apartment on the other side of the city, Knox Aldridge was dealing with another problem. The Brennan family had begun pushing into his territory. Not in any grand, obvious way, just a few business operations along the border suddenly changing hands, a few unfamiliar faces appearing in places where only Knox's people had been before. Small signs, but Knox never ignored small signs. Small signs were how big problems said hello. Tate stood in Knox's office, reading the report. Knox listened until he finished, stayed silent for a moment, then said, "Arrange dinner with Brennan, tomorrow night." Tate nodded, then asked, "How many men should we bring?" "Just me." Tate looked at Knox. Not a look of objection, because Tate never objected, only a look to confirm that he had heard correctly. "Sir, Brennan will bring at least 6 men." Knox fastened the cuff of his shirt slowly. "Good. Frightened men are easy to predict." The next evening, Knox arrived at the restaurant. Just as Tate had said, Brennan had brought 6 bodyguards. They stood scattered around the private dining room, backs against the wall, arms folded across their chests, eyes on the door. Knox walked in alone. He passed those 6 men without looking at any of them, without slowing down, without speeding up, even steps, a flat face, as though he were walking past 6 columns in a lobby, not 6 men paid to be dangerous. Brennan sat at the head of the table, a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, gray suit, large watch. He stood when Knox entered and extended his hand. Knox shook it, sat down, and the two of them began dinner. The meal unfolded normally. Knox talked about the weather, about a new restaurant that had opened downtown, about a football game from the weekend before. His voice was light, even pleasant, like 2 old friends meeting again. Brennan tried to keep pace, but his eyes wouldn't settle. He looked at Knox the way someone looked at a cat playing with a mouse before it had decided when to pounce. The meal lasted nearly an hour. Knox was in no hurry. He ordered dessert, drank his coffee slowly, and throughout all that time, he didn't mention one word about territory, business, or anything connected to the reason they were sitting there. Brennan grew more restless by the minute. He was waiting for Knox to get to the point, and the waiting was what frightened him. At the end of the meal, Knox set his coffee cup down, wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin, then took an envelope from inside his suit jacket. He placed it on the table between them and pushed it lightly toward Brennan. Brennan looked at the envelope, then at Knox. Knox said nothing, only gave a small nod, telling him to open it. Brennan opened it. Inside was a thin file, A few pages, a few photographs. The color drained from his face as he read. The entire secret transport network of the Brennan family. Routes, times, warehouses, names of the people in charge. Everything. So detailed it was as though someone had sat inside Brennan's meeting room for an entire year and written down every word. Brennan looked up. Knox looked at him, his face still calm, his voice still as light as it had been all through dinner. "I know everything about you. You know nothing about me. That's the difference between us." Then Knox stood, buttoned his suit jacket, pushed his chair back in, and walked away. He didn't turn back, didn't wait for a response, didn't need to hear Brennan say anything. The conversation had ended the moment the envelope was opened. Everything after that was only procedure. Knox's car left the restaurant at 10 o'clock at night, but he didn't go back to the penthouse. "Take Birch Street," Knox told the driver. Tate sat in the front seat, turning to look at Knox, but he didn't ask. The car stopped at the head of an old street on the south side of the city. Knox opened the door and stepped out. The neighborhood had changed a great deal since the last time he had come here, and he couldn't remember exactly when that last time had been. Familiar stores had closed or changed owners. The laundromat on the corner had become a phone shop. The barber shop beside it had become a nail salon, but there was one place that still looked exactly the way it did in his memory, even though it had been closed for years. The ice cream shop on Birch Street. Dust clung to the glass door, the sign had faded, and the inside was dark, but it was still there, still the same storefront, still the same green-painted wooden doorframe, though most of the paint had peeled away. Knox stood in front of the ice cream shop, both hands in his pockets. He didn't look at the sign. He looked at the long wooden bench outside the door, the bench where he used to sit every Saturday afternoon, his legs swinging because his feet still didn't touch the ground, one hand holding a chocolate ice cream cone that dripped down his fingers. And beside him was Maggie, sitting with her back straight, holding a vanilla ice cream cone, always eating more slowly than he did, because she said ice cream had to be eaten slowly if you wanted to taste how good it was. How long he stood there, he didn't know. Tate stood 10 steps away, silent, not rushing him. Then Knox took out his phone and called Tate. "Buy this ice cream shop, whatever the price." Tate stepped closer. "Sir, it's just a small ice cream shop that's been closed for." Knox didn't turn around. "I didn't ask for your opinion." Silence held for one beat. Then Knox added, his voice lower, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "And double the men looking for Maggie." It happened on a Tuesday night. Josie finished her office cleaning shift at 12:15, as she always did, stepped out of the building, and turned onto the familiar road that led home through Redmond Park. She was halfway there when she stopped. A black car was parked by the curb near the park gate, lights off, engine running, white smoke drifting from the exhaust pipe. That car didn't belong in this neighborhood. Josie had lived here long enough to know which cars belonged to whom, which ones belonged to neighbors working night shifts, which ones belonged to the kids who liked to gather on the corner. She had never seen this car before. She slowed down, instinct pulling her close to the wall of the building along the street, where the darkness hit her. From there, she saw 2 men standing beside the car, talking to a homeless man sitting on the sidewalk near the entrance to the park. Josie couldn't hear everything, but she caught one piece. An old woman with gray hair usually sits on the stone bench in the park. The homeless man shook his head and said something Josie couldn't hear. One of the 2 men took out his wallet, pulled out a bill, and handed it to him. Then he asked again. The homeless man shook his head again, took the money, and turned away. The 2 men looked around. Josie stepped deeper into the shadows. Her heart was pounding so hard she was afraid they would hear it. She didn't wait any longer. She turned around and took the long way, circling past 2 blocks, through the alley behind the closed laundromat, out to the main road, then back to her apartment building from another direction. It took an extra 15 minutes, but she didn't care. Josie opened the apartment door, stepped inside, locked it, and slid the bolt into place. Maggie was sitting on the bed, leaning against the wall, eyes open. She wasn't asleep. Josie didn't know if Maggie had ever slept through a full night since coming here, because every time Josie came home late, Maggie was awake, watching the door, waiting until she heard the key turn before her shoulders finally dropped. "Someone's looking for you." Josie said it straight. She didn't go in circles because she wasn't the kind of person who went in circles, and she knew Maggie wasn't the kind of person who needed the truth hidden from her. 2 men outside the park, They were asking about an old woman with gray hair who usually sits on the stone bench. Maggie didn't say anything right away, but her face changed. Not the face of someone hearing bad news. It was the face of someone who had been waiting for that bad news for a very long time, and now it had finally arrived. The blood drained from her cheeks, her skin turned gray-white, and Josie saw her hands begin to tremble, even though she was gripping the edge of the blanket tightly. "They're looking for me," Maggie said, her voice low, as though she were speaking to herself. "After all these years, they're still looking." Josie looked at Maggie. She saw that fear again, the same fear she had seen on that rainy night in the park when Maggie grabbed her wrist and told her not to call emergency services. The fear of being found. The fear that had kept her living on the streets, without papers, without an identity, without leaving a trace. Josie didn't ask who they were, not because she didn't want to know, but because she knew this wasn't the time to ask. This was the time to act. She pulled the curtains closed, thin as they were, but enough to keep anyone outside from seeing in. She checked the front door lock again, then dragged the wooden chair from the dining table and wedged it beneath the doorknob. She went into the bathroom to check the small ventilation window on the wall, then came back out and sat down on the bed beside Maggie. "Starting tomorrow," Josie said, "you don't leave the apartment. You don't open the door for anyone. You don't stand near the window. If anyone knocks and it isn't me, you don't answer." Maggie looked at her. Her eyes were wet, not from fear, but from something else. Something close to shame, close to guilt. "I've dragged you into this," she whispered. "You didn't drag me," Josie answered. "I walked in myself." Silence stretched between them. The bucket under the broken pipe in the bathroom kept dripping steadily, like a clock. Then Maggie spoke. Her voice was slow, heavy, as if each word had to be lifted from a very deep place inside her, a place she had tried to keep locked for so many years. "I used to work as a nanny for a very powerful family," she said. "I took care of that boy from the time he was born. His mother was the best person I'd ever met." Maggie stopped, swallowed. She didn't die in an accident. Josie didn't move. "Someone hurt her," Maggie continued, her voice trembling slightly. "And I have proof. I've kept it from then until now. The person who caused it is still alive, still holding power in that family, and he knows that I know." Josie sat very still for a long time. She looked at Maggie, at the redness in her eyes, at the trembling hand clutching the edge of the blanket, and she began to understand. She understood why Maggie had lived on the streets. She understood why she wouldn't go to the hospital. She understood why she had no papers, no name, no address. She understood why Maggie had lived like a shadow for so many years, moving from one city to another, leaving no trace, letting no one know where she was. "That's why you wouldn't go to the hospital," Josie said slowly. Maggie nodded. "That's why you lived on the streets for all these years." Maggie nodded again. Her eyes overflowed. Josie took Maggie's hand, held it tightly, the way Maggie had held hers on that rainy night in the park. "You're not going back to the street," Josie said, "and you're not living alone anymore." Maggie didn't answer. She only held Josie's hand tightly, and the two of them sat there in the small apartment, with the curtains drawn and the chair blocking the door, listening to the bucket drip, listening to the city sleeping outside, and neither one said anything more. But they both knew that from this night on, everything had changed. The loaf of bread split in half on a stone bench in the park had now become something much bigger, and Josie, even though she didn't yet fully understand what she had stepped into, had already decided. She wouldn't step out. The ice cream shop on Birch Street had been open again for 3 weeks when Knox received a call from the new manager. "Sir, there's something a little strange. An old woman keeps coming to sit outside the shop every afternoon. She doesn't come in, doesn't buy anything, just sits on the bench outside the door and looks inside. When security asks her to leave, she leaves, but the next day she comes back." Knox was sitting in his office, and after he heard that, the pen in his hand stopped halfway across the page. "What is she looking at inside?" "The photograph hanging on the wall, sir. The old opening day photo of the shop." Knox knew that photograph. It had been taken on the first day the ice cream shop opened, with the old owner standing in front of the counter, and in the left corner of the picture, blurred but still visible, was a nanny leading a little boy as he ate ice cream by the door. The boy was grinning, ice cream smeared at the corner of his mouth. The nanny stood beside him, one hand resting on his shoulder. "Install a camera outside the door," Knox said. "Record her image. Send it to me." 2 days later, Knox sat alone watching the camera footage. The old woman sat on the bench outside the ice cream shop, looking through the glass at the photograph hanging on the wall. She sat there for nearly an hour, then stood and left. The image wasn't sharp, just an ordinary security camera. The angle filmed from above. But Knox saw something no one else saw. The way she sat, back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. He recognized that posture immediately. The way people recognize their mother's voice even after they haven't heard it for 10 years. Some things the body remembers without needing the mind to confirm. Knox stood up. At that moment, he was in the middle of a meeting with 4 men, discussing a deal worth millions of dollars. He stood up halfway through, and everyone went silent. "Find her," Knox said to Tate, his voice neither rising nor falling. But there was something in his eyes that Tate had never seen before. Right now. Tate deployed a surveillance team around the area near the ice cream shop. 2 days later, they recorded the old woman walking from the ice cream shop toward Maple Street. She was with a young woman wearing a diner apron. Tate traced it back and identified the young woman as an employee at the diner on Maple Street. Morning shift. Her name was Josie Whitfield, 27 years old, living alone in a 4th-floor apartment building on Fairview Street. Tate placed the file on Knox's desk. Knox read it, then folded it closed. "Bring her to me." The next day, Josie finished her shift at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, stepped out of the diner, and saw a black car parked by the curb. A tall man with a cold face opened the car door. "Miss Whitfield, my boss wants to meet you." Josie looked at the car, looked at the man, then looked back at the car. "Who's your boss? Please get in the car." "I don't get into cars with strangers." Tate looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "It concerns the woman staying with you." Josie stood still. That sentence struck exactly where it needed to. She looked at Tate for another 3 seconds, then got into the car. The car took her to a restaurant downtown. The kind of restaurant Josie had never once stepped into. The kind with a heavy wooden door and a doorman in a suit. She was led into a private room in the back. A man sat alone at the table, dressed in a black suit, hair neatly combed, face calm. In front of him was only a glass of water. Knox watched Josie walk in. She was thinner than he had imagined, more tired than he had imagined, but her eyes were bright and sharp, the kind of eyes that didn't get fooled easily. "Sit down," Knox said. Josie didn't sit. She stood there, both hands at her sides, looking at Knox, looking at the room, looking at Tate standing outside the door. "I'm listening." Knox tilted his head slightly. "I need to ask you about someone. An old woman named Maggie." Josie didn't blink. "I don't know any woman named Maggie." A lie. Knox knew it. Tate had confirmed it. The camera had recorded it. Everything was clear. But this waitress stood in front of him, inside his restaurant, brought here in his car, and lied straight to his face without trembling. Knox didn't encounter that very often. "You brought me here in a black car," Josie said, her voice steady. "Put a man outside the door, then asked me about an old woman. You thought I'd be scared and tell you everything?" She looked straight into Knox's eyes. "You picked the wrong person." Knox looked at her. He had sat across from men who controlled millions of dollars, and still sweat ran down their temples when they spoke to him. But this girl, with nothing in her hands except a grease-stained apron and thin sandals, was looking at him as though he was the one who needed to explain himself, not her. Knox decided to tell the truth, not because he wanted to, because he understood that this person wouldn't say anything unless she believed him, and she wouldn't believe him unless he told the truth. "Her name is Maggie Callahan," Knox said, his voice lower. "She raised me from the moment I was born. She left when I was still young, without a word. I've been looking for her for 20 years. Josie stood there, looking at Knox, and for the first time, she saw something else in this man's eyes. Not power, not coldness, loss. She remembered the fragments Maggie had told her on the stone bench in the park. The boy afraid of thunder, the house with 12 bedrooms, the lullaby on rainy nights, the man sitting in front of her, in an expensive suit, inside a fine restaurant, with a bodyguard standing outside the door, was the boy in those stories. Josie stayed silent for a long time. Then she said, "If you want to see her, you have to promise me one thing. You won't hurt her." Knox looked at her. "You're standing in the doorway against me to protect her. You think I'm the person who would hurt her?" "I don't know what kind of man you are," Josie answered. "I only know she's afraid of someone, And you just showed up with a black car and a bodyguard. Knox nodded. I promise. Josie looked at him for a long while longer. She wasn't someone who trusted easily, but she had seen Knox's eyes when he said the words, 20 years, and those eyes weren't lying. She knew because she had seen the same eyes every morning in the mirror, the eyes of someone who had lost somebody and never stopped searching. Come with me, Josie said, and she led Knox Aldridge to the 4th-floor apartment on Fairview Street, where Maggie was sitting on the bed, curtains drawn, chair blocking the door, waiting for Josie to come home. Maggie let go of Knox only after a very long time. She lifted her hand and touched his face, her trembling palm moving over his cheekbones, over his jaw, as though she were reading again, a book she had known by heart, but still had to confirm that every page was there. You've grown so much, she said, her voice choked. Knox didn't answer. He looked around the apartment. With one sweep of his eyes, he understood everything. He took out his phone and called Tate. Private doctor. At this address within 1 hour. He hung up, turned to Maggie, and his voice was gentle. But it wasn't a question. You're coming home with me. Maggie didn't answer right away. She looked over at Josie, the girl still standing in the corner of the room, her back against the wall, both arms folded across her chest. Josie looked at Maggie, then gave a small nod. Go, Maggie. He'll take better care of you than I can. Knox turned to Josie. He looked at her for a moment, then said, I owe you. You don't owe me anything, Josie answered. Take care of her. She turned away and began folding Maggie's clothes into a cloth bag, the old clothes that belonged to Josie, the ones Maggie had worn for the past several weeks. She packed the heart medication, the water bottle, the small odds and ends, then handed the bag to Tate, who was standing by the door. 15 minutes later, the black car drove away. Josie stood at the window, looking down into the alley, watching the line of cars disappear at the end of the street. Then she turned back and looked at the apartment. The bed was empty. The pillow still held the hollow where Maggie's head had rested. She sat down on the edge of the bed, placed her hand on the pillow, and stayed there for a very long time in a room that had suddenly become wider and emptier than ever. The next morning at the diner, Josie told Darlene that Maggie had been picked up by family. She didn't give details, only mentioned the name Knox Aldridge when Darlene asked who had come for her. Darlene was pouring coffee, and when she heard it, her hand stopped. She looked at Josie, eyes wide. Knox Aldridge? Darlene set the coffee pot down. Do you know who that man is? Josie shook her head. Darlene looked at her the way someone looks at a child who has just said she crossed a highway on foot without knowing it. Knox Aldridge is the mob boss, Josie. The Aldridge family. Do you understand? The kind of man no one in this entire city dares to say by name. Josie stood still beside the counter. She thought of the man in the black suit last night, the man who had stepped into her run-down apartment, had sat beside an old woman's bed, and had lowered his head onto her shoulder while trembling. A mob boss. She had stood in the doorway against the most powerful mob boss in the city and said, You picked the wrong person. You need to stay away from him, Darlene said. Do you hear me? Josie looked at Darlene. She understood that Darlene was worried for her. She understood what the name Knox Aldridge meant to the people who lived in this city. But she had also seen something Darlene had not seen. She had seen Knox's reddened eyes when he said the 3 words, I feared thunder. She had seen his hand tremble when he held Maggie's hand. She had seen the mob boss disappear and the little boy come through. Maggie is safe, Josie said. That's the only thing I care about. Then she tied her apron again, picked up a tray of food, and stepped out to serve the tables. The Aldridge family mansion stood on the hill north of the city, behind an iron gate 3 meters high, and a row of cedar trees trimmed into perfect straight lines. Maggie was brought into the first-floor living room, where Knox's private doctor was already waiting. She sat in the chair, her eyes moving around the vast room whose every corner she had once known by heart, and she said nothing. When the doctor finished examining her, he pulled Knox out into the hallway. Her heart is very weak, her blood pressure is low, and her heartbeat is irregular. She needs constant monitoring and the correct dosage of medication. I don't know how long she's lived without proper medicine, but her body is at its limit. Knox listened, his face unchanged. Take care of her. Anything she needs. The doctor nodded and went back into the room. Knox stood in the hallway for a while longer, looking through the slightly open door into the living room, watching Maggie sit curled in the chair, so small in a room much too large. Then he turned away. He hadn't taken 3 steps before he met Paxton. Paxton Aldridge, Knox's uncle, was walking from the direction of the study toward the staircase. He stopped when he saw Knox and gave him his familiar smile. Paxton was the kind of man whose smile was always ready on his lips, whose voice was always gentle, whose gestures were always proper. He was Knox's closest advisor, the man who sat on Knox's right in every meeting, the man who had guided Knox into his current position after his father died. Everyone in the family respected Paxton. Everyone trusted Paxton, and Paxton always smiled. But if anyone looked closely, they would see that smile never reached his eyes. "You brought a guest home?" Paxton asked cheerfully. Knox looked at his uncle. "Maggie, she's back." Paxton's smile didn't change. It didn't widen, didn't shrink. It stayed the same, flawless, like a layer of paint carefully brushed into place. "Maggie," Paxton said slowly, as though savoring the name on his tongue. "It's been a long time. I should go in and say hello." Paxton stepped into the living room. Maggie was sitting in the chair, both hands folded in her lap, eyes lowered. When she heard the footsteps, she looked up, and if Josie had been there in that moment, she would have recognized at once what she had seen before. Fear, the same fear from the rainy night, the same fear from when Josie mentioned the 2 men asking about her in the park. But this time, the fear was darker. Maggie looked at Paxton, and her entire body went rigid. Her hands clenched the fabric of the chair. Her shoulders drew inward. "Maggie," Paxton said, stopping a few steps away from her, both hands clasped in front of his stomach, wearing the warmest smile he had. "It's been far too long. I'm glad you're back." Maggie didn't answer. She only looked at Paxton with the eyes of an animal that recognized the hunter had found its den. Paxton showed no sign of displeasure. He gave a slight nod, said a few more polite words, then turned and left. In the hallway, he passed Knox and patted his nephew on the shoulder. "Good. She needs to rest." Then he walked straight back to his private study, closed the door, and sat down at his desk. The smile vanished. Paxton sat still for a moment, thinking. Then he picked up the phone and called a number. "The girl who brought Maggie to the mansion today. Find out where she lives." That afternoon, when Josie came to the mansion to visit Maggie for the first time, a car parked 2 blocks from the mansion gate recorded the bus number she had taken, the route where she got off, and followed her from the bus stop all the way to the door of her apartment building on Fairview Street. The address was sent back to Paxton before Josie even managed to step into the building. 3 days later, Josie's landlord received a phone call. A man's voice, polite. "I'm the brother of Josie Whitfield on the 4th floor. My sister told me the pipe in her apartment is broken and still hasn't been fixed. I'd like to send a repairman to fix it for her. Could you let him in while she's at work?" The landlord agreed. On the morning Josie went to work her breakfast shift. A man dressed as a plumber stepped into the 4th floor apartment, carrying a toolbox. He stayed inside for 15 minutes, then left. The pipe was not fixed. But under the bed, where Josie never looked, there was now a brown paper bag containing $50,000 in cash. That night, Paxton sat with Knox at dinner in the mansion dining room. Uncle and nephew talked about business as they always did. Then Paxton put down his fork, leaned slightly toward Knox, his voice soft as if he were sharing some idle little thought. "You know, I've been thinking, and something feels odd." "What feels odd?" "That waitress, Josie." Paxton took a sip of wine. "She just happened to take care of Maggie for months, didn't ask for anything, didn't question anything, didn't call the police, didn't call social services, just quietly hid her in her home." He set the glass down. "Who does that, Knox? Who takes care of a homeless old woman for months without asking a single question, unless that person already knows who the old woman is?" Knox looked at his uncle. He said nothing. "I don't want to think badly of her," Paxton continued, his voice full of sincere concern. "But if she knew Maggie from the beginning, knew Maggie once worked for our family, then the next question is, what does she want? I only want you to be careful. She may not be as simple as she looks." Knox sat still for a very long time after that dinner. What Paxton planted in his mind wasn't a large suspicion, only a small seed. But a small seed was enough. He called Tate. "Check Josie Whitfield's apartment again." More thoroughly. Tate checked, and under the bed in the 4th floor apartment, he found a brown paper bag containing $50,000 in cash. Tate called Knox. Knox listened, silent for 10 seconds. Then he said, "Bring her to me." Tate picked Josie up at the diner door the moment her shift ended. This time, there was no polite invitation. Only one sentence. "Mr. Aldridge needs to see you. Right now." Josie looked at Tate, looked at the familiar black car, and understood from Tate's eyes that this wasn't an ordinary meeting. She got into the car without asking. The car didn't go to the restaurant from before. It went to the mansion. Josie was led into a room on the first floor. The door closed, the curtains drawn. Knox was already sitting at the table. In front of him was a brown paper envelope. Josie stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. Knox didn't invite her to sit. He didn't greet her. He picked up the envelope, set it on the table, and pushed it toward her. "Open it." Josie opened the envelope. Inside were stacks of cash. She looked at the money, then looked at Knox. "Explain. One word." His voice was flat, cold, the kind of voice she had never heard from him before. Not even the first time they met at the restaurant. That time, he had been cold, but there had still been something behind it. This time, there was nothing. This was the voice of the mob boss Darlene had warned her about. "Where did this money come from?" Josie asked. "From your apartment," Knox answered. "Under the bed." Josie looked back at the envelope. $50,000. She had never seen that much money in her life. That amount was more than her entire yearly income. That amount could pay off her debts, fix the broken pipe, buy back her mother's coat, and still leave money behind. And someone had hidden it under her bed. "I don't know where this money came from," Josie said. "I've never seen it before." Knox looked at her. His eyes weren't the eyes of the man who had sat beside Maggie's bed, not the eyes of the boy who had been afraid of thunder. These were the eyes of a man deciding who she was, and Josie knew that if he decided wrong, her life would become very difficult. "The money was in your apartment," Knox said again, slowly, word by word. "You took care of Maggie for 4 months. You asked for nothing. Then I found $50,000 under your bed. What do you want me to think?" Josie understood. She understood clearly, sharply, like a door opening and light flooding in. Someone had hidden the money in her apartment for Knox to find. Someone wanted Knox to think she was a fraud. Someone wanted Knox not to trust her. Josie straightened her back. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She didn't give some long explanation. She looked straight into Knox's eyes and said, "Believe I'm a fraud if you want. But ask yourself one question. Who benefits most when you don't trust me?" Then she stood, turned her back, and walked out of the room. No one stopped her. Tate looked at Knox. Knox sat still, staring at the empty chair Josie had just left behind. Josie took the bus home. She sat in the last row, looking out through the glass, and she was angry. Not angry because she had been falsely accused. Angry because she had seen the boy afraid of thunder in Knox's eyes. She had trusted that man. She had handed Maggie over to him, and he had looked at her with those eyes. Eyes that suspected she was someone who sold kindness for money. But Josie wasn't the kind of person who sat still with anger. She went home, changed clothes, then walked straight down to the first floor and knocked on the landlord's door. "Have you let anyone into my apartment recently?" The landlord thought for a moment. "Yes, a plumber. Your brother called and asked me to let him fix the pipe." "My brother," Josie said it slowly. "My brother called. Yes, a man called, said he was your brother. Said his sister was busy working, so he asked the plumber to come." Josie didn't have an older brother. She only had Wesley, her younger brother, and Wesley was at college, hundreds of miles away. She asked more questions. When, what time, what the repairman looked like, how long he stayed, what he carried. The landlord remembered a few details. Josie went back to her apartment, took out paper and a pen, and wrote everything down. Date, time, description, how long he had been inside. She didn't know who had done this, but she knew it wasn't random. Someone had entered her home, hidden money under her bed, then arranged for Knox to find it. Someone knew her address, knew when she went to work, knew she lived alone, and someone wanted her gone from Knox and Maggie's life. That same week, Josie came home from her night shift. She was walking along Fairview Street, 2 blocks from her apartment building, when she realized 2 men were walking behind her. Not too close, not too far, about 10 steps away. She walked faster. They walked faster. She turned onto another street. They turned with her. Then they stopped. One of the 2 men spoke, his voice calm, neither loud nor quiet, just enough for Josie to hear clearly in the empty night. "That old woman isn't your business. Stop while you still can." Then both men turned around, walked the other way, and disappeared around the corner. Josie stood still on the sidewalk. Her legs couldn't move. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it beating in her ears. She stood there for 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Then she ran back to the apartment building, up 4 flights of stairs, into her apartment, locked the door, slid the bolt, and dragged the chair in front of it. She sat on the floor in the darkness, her back against the door, both arms wrapped around her knees, and trembled. She didn't call Knox. She was still angry, and she also didn't know whether Knox was the person she should call. She didn't know who she could still trust. But someone knew. Tate, whom Knox had assigned to watch and protect Josie from the early days under an old order, had seen everything. The 2 men, Fairview Street, 10:45 at night. Tate called Knox. Josie Whitfield was followed. 2 men. They warned her to stay away from Maggie. "I identified one of them, sir. He works for someone inside the family." Knox was silent. "Who?" "One of Mr. Paxton's men, sir." Knox said nothing more. He sat in his study, alone, in the dark. Josie's words echoed in his head. "Who benefits most when you don't trust me?" Knox picked up the phone and called Tate back. "Those 2 men. Send my regards." Tate understood. Before dawn the next morning, the 2 men from Fairview Street had left the city. 3 days later, Knox Aldridge walked into the diner on Maple Street at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, alone. No Tate, no black car parked outside, no bodyguards standing in the hallway. Just one man in a black shirt, without a suit jacket, stepping into a modest neighborhood diner and sitting down at the small table by the window. He ordered black coffee. Josie was carrying a tray of food to table number 7 when she saw him. She stopped in the middle of the aisle. Knox sat there, both hands resting on the table, looking at her. Not with the cold eyes from their last meeting, not with the eyes of a mob boss, or the eyes of the little boy afraid of thunder. This was another kind of look. The look of a man who knew he had been wrong, and had come here not to give orders. Josie carried the tray to table number 7, set down the food, then turned back toward the counter. From the pocket of her apron, she took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, worn and creased, because she had carried it with her for several days, waiting for the right moment. She walked to Knox's table and placed the paper beside his coffee cup. "You want to know who hid the money in my apartment?" Josie said, her voice even. Not angry, not cold, only the voice of someone who was ready. "This is what I found. The day the plumber entered my apartment, the time he came in, the time he left. My landlord's description, the phone call from someone pretending to be my brother." She paused. "I don't have an older brother. I only have a younger brother, and he's in college hundreds of miles away. Whoever called my landlord knew my address, knew my work hours, and knew how to get into my apartment when I wasn't there." Knox picked up the paper. He read it, handwriting, slightly slanted, small but clear. Date, time, details, everything neatly written on one page. The waitress had no power, no men, no money. But she had investigated on her own with empty hands, by asking her landlord, by remembering every detail, by using the alertness of someone used to living alone and knowing when something wasn't right. She had found more than his entire team had found in this matter. Knox set the paper down, looked at Josie. "I don't need you to save me," Josie said, "but I need you to listen to me." Knox was silent for a moment. Then he said, his voice low, "I was wrong." 2 words. No further explanation, no excuse, no long account of why he had suspected her. Just 2 words. Josie looked at him. She had been ready for an argument, ready for him to deny it, ready for him to defend himself. She wasn't ready for those 2 words. "And I won't let anyone touch you again," Knox added. Josie didn't answer right away. She looked at him, weighing him, then pulled out the chair and sat down across from him. For the first time, she sat at the same table as Knox. For the first time, they were level with each other. Not her standing while he sat, not him asking while she answered. 2 people sitting across from each other in a simple diner, amid the clatter of dishes and the smell of cheap coffee. Knox reached into his shirt pocket, took something out, and placed it on the table. A tin box. Old, dented at the corners, its lid slightly bent, but wiped clean. Josie recognized it at once. It was the box Maggie always held while sleeping in the park. The box she had clutched in her hand on that rainy night when Josie helped her up 4 flights of stairs. Josie had never asked what was inside. "Maggie asked me to give this to you," Knox said. Josie looked at the box, then at Knox. "She asked you?" "She said you'd understand." Josie picked up the tin box. Light. She opened the lid. Inside were 2 things. A handwritten letter on yellowed paper, its folds so worn the paper was nearly torn along the creases, as though someone had opened and closed it hundreds of times over the years. And a smaller note, the writing shaky but clear. Maggie's handwriting. Josie read the smaller note first. "If anything happens to me, give this letter to the boy. You're the only person I trust." Josie read it twice. Then she looked up. Knox was looking at the box, his eyes fixed on the yellowed letter. He knew that letter existed. Maggie had mentioned it, but she hadn't given it to him. She had given it to Josie. "Maggie kept this box for years out on the street," Josie said slowly. "She lost everything, but she never lost this box, and she gave it to me." Josie understood. Knox understood too. Maggie had chosen Josie to guard the secret before Knox ever appeared. Not because Josie was stronger than Knox, not because Josie had power, but because Maggie trusted Josie, trusted her with a kind of faith that couldn't be bought with money, couldn't be forced with power, and could only be built through 4 months of sharing bread on a stone bench in the park. "Maggie wants you to keep the letter," Knox said. "But I need to know. What does it say?" Josie looked at Knox. She took the yellowed letter, carefully folded it back along the old creases, placed it in the tin box, and closed the lid. "When the time is right, she'll tell you herself," Josie said. "It isn't my place." Knox looked at her. The man the whole city was afraid to refuse had just been refused by a waitress for the 2nd time. Not because she was afraid, not because she hated him, but because she respected Maggie more than she respected him, and she wouldn't betray the old woman's trust just because he wanted to know. Knox gave a slight nod. He didn't press further. He stood, placed several bills on the table for the coffee he hadn't finished, then walked out of the diner. Josie remained seated alone, the tin box in her hands. She looked through the window, watched Knox get into the car, and thought of Maggie inside the mansion, lying on a soft bed instead of a stone bench in the park, cared for by doctors, instead of a waitress cooking porridge at midnight. But Maggie had still sent the box to her, not to Knox, to her. Josie untied her apron, placed the tin box into her bag, tied the apron again, and went back to carrying trays and serving tables. Darlene watched her from behind the counter, wanting to ask but not asking. Josie didn't say anything either. She only worked, the way she did every day, as though nothing had changed. But inside her bag, the tin box was heavier than anything she had ever carried. The doctor called Knox out into the hallway after the 2nd examination. The first time, he had said Maggie's heart was weak. This time, he said something different. "Advanced heart failure. Her heart muscle has been damaged for far too long without treatment. I can use medication to keep her stable, but you need to understand that this isn't a cure. This is prolonging time." Knox stood in the hallway, his hands in his pockets, his face without expression. "How long?" "A few weeks. If she responds well to the medication, maybe a few months, but I don't want you to expect more than that." Knox looked at the doctor. "Find the best doctor in the country, a cardiology specialist. Whoever is the best, bring that person here." The doctor looked at Knox, stayed silent for 1 beat, then said very gently, "Sir, I'm the best person Mr. Tate could find, and I've consulted 2 other specialists. The conclusion is the same." Knox stood there. He said nothing more. The doctor nodded and went back into the room. Knox remained alone in the long hallway of the mansion, where every painting hanging on the wall was worth more than Josie's entire apartment, where every door opened with money and closed with power. But there wasn't a single door in this house that led to a place where more time could be bought. Knox Aldridge, the man whose single phone call could change the fate of anyone in this city, was standing outside a sick room and, for the first time in his life, realizing there were things for which all his money and power were completely useless. Josie came to visit Maggie every day. She took the bus to the mansion after her morning shift, sat with Maggie for a few hours, then got back in time for her night shift. Every time she came, she brought food she had cooked herself, even though the mansion had its own chef, because Maggie liked Josie's cooking better. Cook it like the noodles that day, Maggie often said. And Josie knew she was talking about the plate of instant noodles with egg and scallions that Maggie had cooked for her in the fourth-floor apartment. During those visits, Josie began to notice something. Paxton Aldridge, Knox's uncle, always appeared when Knox was present. He would step into Maggie's room, ask after her with a few polite questions, smile, say he was glad she was feeling better, then leave. In front of Knox, Paxton was a caring uncle, attentive, proper, and perfectly measured. But Josie noticed something else. On the days she visited and Knox wasn't at the mansion, Paxton didn't enter Maggie's room. He only walked past, slowly, then stopped at the door and looked in. He said nothing, only looked, then walked on. The first time, Josie thought perhaps he was just checking whether Maggie was all right. The second time, she began to find it strange. The third time, she was certain that wasn't the look of someone who cared. That was the look of someone keeping watch. One afternoon, Josie came to visit Maggie and found her crying. Not loudly. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, both hands gripping the edge of the blanket, her eyes staring into empty space. Josie sat down beside the bed and didn't ask right away. She only placed her hand over Maggie's and waited. Maggie stayed silent for a very long time. Then she said, her voice shaking, "He came in here, when Knox was away." "Paxton?" Maggie nodded. "What did he say?" Maggie swallowed. Her eyes lowered, as if she were trying to find a way to speak something that had been pressing on her chest for far too long. "He told me the truth, but he said it in a way that made it impossible for me to open my mouth." Josie stayed quiet, waiting. "He said, 'What happens if you speak?' His mother contacted the FBI. His mother wanted to destroy the family from inside. Do you think Knox will be proud when he finds that out? Or will he hate both his mother and you?" Maggie stopped, her breath trembling. Then he said, "If you stay silent, Knox can still keep the beautiful image he has of his mother. If you open your mouth, you'll shatter the last thing he has left." Josie sat still. She understood the trap. It wasn't a trap made of money, like the $50,000 under the bed. This was a trap made of truth. Paxton was using the truth itself as a weapon. If Maggie spoke, Knox would learn that his mother had contacted the FBI to bring down the family. That truth wouldn't only expose Paxton, it would also break the image of the mother Knox had carried in his heart his whole life. If Maggie opened her mouth, she wouldn't just be accusing Paxton. She would also be taking away the last thing Knox had, the beautiful memory of his mother. And Paxton knew that. He knew Maggie loved Knox so much that she would rather carry the secret silently into the grave than hurt him. "Maggie," Josie said slowly, "why did his mother contact the FBI?" "Because she wanted to get her child out of this life," Maggie answered. Her voice choked. She didn't want Knox to grow up in the family. She wanted the boy to have a normal life. Josie held Maggie's hand more tightly. Then she didn't betray the family. She was saving her child. "If Knox is the man I think he is, he'll understand that." Maggie looked at Josie, her eyes filled with doubt and hope at the same time. "You don't know how Knox will react." "I don't know," Josie admitted, "but I know you don't have much time left. And if you don't speak, then the person who caused all of this wins. He's counting down with you. He's waiting for you to stay silent until you can't speak anymore." Maggie didn't answer, but Josie saw something change in her eyes. Not courage. Not yet, but a small crack in the wall of fear she had built for so many years. That evening, Josie asked to see Knox. He was in his study, reading documents. Josie stepped in and stood in front of the desk without sitting. "I need you to listen to me," she said. "The $50,000 in my apartment, the 2 men who followed me on Fairview Street, and the person behind all of it." She paused. "You already know whose men they were," Tate told you. Knox looked at her, neither confirming nor denying it. "Now I need you to do one thing," Josie said. "Listen to Maggie. Let her speak. She's holding something she has wanted to tell you for a long time but has been too afraid to say, because she's afraid it will hurt you, but you need to hear it. Before it's too late." Knox looked at Josie. "Because someone is counting down her time with her," Josie said. "And that person isn't the doctor." Knox came to Maggie's room the next morning. He closed the door, pulled a chair beside the bed, and said, "Tell me, I'm listening." Maggie looked at Knox. She looked for a long time, as though she were looking at the little boy from years ago one last time before breaking everything that boy had believed in. Then she began to tell him. She told him about his mother, Genevieve Aldridge, the most beautiful woman Maggie had ever met. Not beautiful because of her face, but beautiful because of the way she loved her son. Genevieve loved Knox with the kind of love Maggie had only seen once in her life. The kind of love that made a mother willing to burn down the whole world she was standing in, so her child could live in another one. "Your mother didn't want you to grow up in the family," Maggie said, her voice slow, heavy, every word carefully weighed. "She saw what you would become if you stayed. She couldn't accept that. So she contacted the FBI. Secretly, no one knew except me, because I was the only person she trusted." Knox sat still. His face didn't change, but the hand resting on his thigh slowly clenched tighter. "What was she planning to do?" Knox asked, his voice low. "She planned to give information so the FBI could intervene, in exchange for witness protection for the two of you. She wanted to take you away, change your names, and live a normal life somewhere no one knew what the Aldridge family was." Maggie stopped. Swallowed. "But someone found out." Knox looked at Maggie. He knew what the next sentence would be. He had known since Josie spoke to him the night before. He had known since Tate confirmed that the two men who had followed Josie were Paxton's men. He had known since $50,000 appeared under the waitress's bed. But knowing and hearing were two different things. "Who?" he asked. "Paxton," Maggie said. One word. It fell into the room like a stone dropping onto the surface of a still lake. "Paxton found out your mother had contacted the FBI. He saw it as betrayal of the family, and he was behind the accident." Knox didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe any harder. He sat there like a statue, and only the hand on his thigh, clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, showed that something inside him was breaking. "That night," Maggie continued, her voice trembling now, but she didn't stop anymore, as though once she had begun, she had to say all of it before her courage left her. "I woke up because I heard Paxton talking on the phone in the hallway. I heard him talk about the car, about the road, about the timing. The next morning, your mother was dead. An accident, they said, but I knew it wasn't an accident." "Why didn't you say anything?" Knox asked. His voice was still flat. But that question carried the weight of more than 20 years. "Because no one believes a nanny," Maggie answered. "And because Paxton knew I knew. He came to see me 2 days after the funeral. He didn't say much. He only said one sentence. 'You should go far away.' I understood what that sentence meant." "That's why you left," Knox said. "It wasn't a question. I left because if I'd stayed, I wouldn't have lived long enough to tell you this." Maggie reached out and touched Knox's hand, gently, shakily. "But before I left, I took the letter your mother had written. She wrote it for you the night before she died. She hid it in my room because she knew that if anything happened, I'd find it. I kept that letter all these years. And I came back because I knew I didn't have much time left. I wanted to be near you one last time. I didn't dare meet you. I only dared sit outside the ice cream shop and look at the photograph on the wall." Knox withdrew his hand from Maggie's, slowly, not abruptly, just drew it back, placed it on his thigh, then stood. He didn't look at Maggie. He walked to the door, opened it, stepped into the hallway, and closed the door behind him. Maggie sat on the bed, looking at the closed door, and cried. In the hallway, Knox stood with his back against the wall. He closed his eyes, both hands clenched at his sides, so tightly that the tendons at his wrists stood out and his knuckles turned white. He breathed heavily. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths. Then he opened his eyes. Calm returned to his face so quickly that anyone who saw it would have been afraid. Because it wasn't the calm of a man whose anger had faded. It was the calm of a man who had finished deciding. Knox took out his phone and called Tate. "Arrange dinner with Uncle Paxton. Tonight. Private dining room. Just the two of us." That night, Knox and Paxton sat across from each other in the mansion dining room. Yellow light, a long wooden table, 2 plates of roasted meat, 2 glasses of wine. Paxton talked about a new deal on the west side of the city. Knox listened, nodded at the right times, asked the right questions. Dinner went on normally, completely normally. At the end of the meal, Paxton leaned back, swirled his wine glass, and smiled. "It's been a long time since the two of us had dinner alone like this." Knox nodded. Then he reached into the pocket of his suit jacket, took out 3 things, and placed them on the table. First, the handwritten letter on yellowed paper. The letter his mother had written on her final night. Second, a photograph printed from the mansion's security camera. It showed Paxton standing at the door of Maggie's room, looking in, while Knox wasn't there. Third, a phone. The screen lit, recording. Paxton looked at the three things on the table. The smile on his lips slowly died. Slowly, gradually, like a candle flame blown out by wind. "I'm giving you three choices," Knox said, his voice gentle. The same voice he had used with Brennan. The same voice he had used with the man who had skimmed money in the meeting room. The same voice the entire city knew meant that when Knox Aldridge spoke that way, everything had already been decided. 1. You leave on your own. Quietly. Cleanly. 2. I send everything to the federal authorities. 3. Knox paused, looking straight into Paxton's eyes. You stay and face me. But I don't think you want that choice. Paxton looked at Knox. More than 20 years ago, he had looked at an orphaned boy sitting in the living room after his mother's funeral, and he had decided to turn that boy into a mob boss. Now that mob boss sat across from him, evidence on the table, a phone recording, and Paxton realized that he had succeeded too well. That boy had become the very thing he had created, and the thing he had created was now looking back at him with the coldest eyes he had ever seen. Everything I did, Paxton said, his voice still calm but without the smile now, was for the family. Knox looked at his uncle. So was my mother, he said. But she did it for me. You. Knox paused for one beat. Only did it for yourself. Paxton looked at Knox for 3 more seconds. Then he stood, pushed his chair back into place, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the room. He didn't look back. The door closed. Knox sat alone in the dining room. He looked at the empty chair across from him. Then he stood, walked to the family portrait hanging on the dining room wall. The picture showed 4 people: his father, his mother, Paxton, and Knox as a child. Knox lifted the portrait off the wall. He didn't smash it, didn't tear it. He placed it face down on the table, the image turned toward the wood, then walked out. Tate was standing in the hallway. Knox walked past him. Clear out his room. Everything. Before morning. Yes, sir. Knox stopped. He didn't turn around. And Tate. Never mention his name in this house again. Knox went to the cemetery the following afternoon. He didn't ask Tate to drive. He drove himself, alone, for the first time in a very long while, sitting behind the wheel like an ordinary man instead of a mob boss under escort. Rain began to fall as he parked outside the cemetery gate. He didn't bring an umbrella. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't bring anything at all. He walked through the iron gate, followed the stone path between 2 rows of graves, and stopped before a black granite headstone carved with the name Genevieve Aldridge. Rain fell on his shoulders, soaking through his shirt, but he didn't move. He stood before his mother's grave, hands hanging at his sides, staring at the name cut into stone. He had come here many times before, every year on the anniversary of her death, every time with flowers, every time standing here. He had thought of his mother as a woman lost in a car accident, a random tragedy, something no one was to blame for. For more than 20 years, he had believed that. For more than 20 years, he had laid flowers on the grave of the woman he thought fate had taken from him, while the person truly responsible sat beside him at every dinner, patted his shoulder, and called him nephew. Today, Knox had brought no flowers. He had come here not to mourn. He had come here to apologize for not knowing, to apologize for trusting the wrong person for so many years, to apologize because his mother had tried to save him, and he had grown up to become the very thing she had wanted him to escape. He didn't say it out loud. He only stood there, under the rain, empty-handed, and his silence was heavier than any words could have been. Josie came to the cemetery that same afternoon. She didn't know Knox was there. She came for her own reasons. On the other side of the cemetery, nearly 100 meters from Genevieve Aldridge's grave, there were 2 small headstones lying beside each other, Josie's father and mother. She came here whenever life pushed her to the edge, not to cry, but to stand before her parents' graves and remind herself that she had survived everything up to this moment, and she would keep surviving. She placed 2 small flowers she had bought at a convenience store on the way, 1 flower on each grave, then stood there for a while beneath the rain. When she turned to leave, she saw him. Across the cemetery, a man stood alone before a grave, without an umbrella, without flowers, his shoulders drenched with rain. Josie recognized that stance. Straight back, broad shoulders, head slightly bowed. Knox. She stopped, hesitated. This wasn't her business. She could turn away, walk out through the gate, take the bus home, and Knox would never know she had been here. But then she remembered something Maggie had said to her the last time she visited. Maggie had held Josie's hand, looked at her with eyes that had already begun to grow dim, and said, "Don't let him be alone. He thinks he's strong, but he's never known how to let anyone stay beside him." Josie crossed the cemetery, past the rows of headstones, across the wet grass. She came to stand beside Knox. She said nothing. She didn't touch him. She only stood beside him, half a step away, letting the rain soak them both. Knox didn't look over right away. He knew someone was standing beside him. He also knew who it was, because the smell of frying oil from the diner still faintly clung to the apron. Josie hadn't had time to take off. "What are you doing here?" Knox asked, his eyes still on the headstone. "Visiting my parents," Josie answered. "They're on the other side." Knox turned to look at her. Rain ran down both their faces, but neither of them bothered to wipe it away. He looked at Josie, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not the waitress, not the woman who had stood in the doorway, not the person guarding the tin box, but someone who also stood before her parents' grave, alone, in the rain, just like him. She was orphaned too. She had lost her mother and father too. She had lived the rest of her life by pretending she was fine too. Knox asked very softly, so softly the rain almost swallowed it, "Does it get better? With time?" Josie looked at the headstone in front of Knox, looked at the name Genevieve Aldridge. Then she looked toward her parents' graves on the other side of the cemetery, far away, small, 2 modest headstones among hundreds of others. "No," she said, "but you learn how to stand steadier." The two of them stood there for a while longer. Neither said anything else. Rain fell, the grass was wet, and 2 orphans stood beside each other in a cemetery, each remembering the person they had lost. And for the first time, neither of them was standing alone. A few weeks later, Maggie's health worsened quickly. She began to sleep more than she was awake, began forgetting meals, began calling people by the wrong names, sometimes calling Josie Genevieve, sometimes calling Knox by his father's name. The doctor came every day, adjusting her medication, but everyone knew the medicine was only keeping a candle from going out in the wind, not lighting it again. One evening, Josie came to the mansion after her morning shift. Knox was already in Maggie's room. He sat in the chair on the left side of the bed, his hand resting on the edge of the blanket. Josie sat down in the chair on the right. Maggie lay between them, small, fragile, her silver hair spread across the white pillow. She opened her eyes, looked left, and saw Knox, looked right, and saw Josie. She smiled. A small smile, weak but real, the smile of someone who had found what she needed to find before leaving. She reached out both hands. Her left hand held Knox's hand. Her right hand held Josie's. Her hands were small, cold, all bone, but they gripped tightly, tighter than the strength of an old woman lying in a sickbed should have allowed, as though she were holding the two of them beside her with everything she had left. She looked at Knox. "Your mother loved you more than anything in this world," she said, her voice slow, each word needing a breath. "Everything she did was because she wanted you to have a different life. You may be angry at her for how she did it, but don't ever be angry at her for why she did it. She did it for you." Knox held Maggie's hand. He said nothing. His jaw tightened, the muscle rising beneath his skin, but his eyes never left hers. Maggie turned to Josie. "You," she said, her voice softer, warmer. "You picked me up from a stone bench. You fed me when you didn't have enough food for yourself. You gave me your bed when you had only one bed. You carried me up 4 flights of stairs on a rainy night, cooked porridge for me, and stayed awake all night watching over me." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "You let me leave this world as a person, not as a shadow on the street." Josie bit her lip. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried for years. Hadn't cried when she lost her parents. Hadn't cried when she sold her mother's coat. Hadn't cried when she sat on the sidewalk after losing her wallet. But that sentence, "not as a shadow on the street," touched a place in her chest she had thought was sealed shut long ago. Her tears fell, silently. She didn't wipe them away. Maggie looked at both of them. "You two are more alike than you think," she said. and a small smile flickered across her lips. Both stubborn, both afraid to trust people, both pretending you don't need anyone. She squeezed both their hands tighter. "Promise me, don't pretend anymore." Knox looked at Maggie. Josie looked at Maggie. Neither of them said, "I promise." But both of them squeezed her hands back, and Maggie understood. She closed her eyes, still smiling, still holding their hands. Josie sat there until late into the night. Knox sat there too. No one left. Maggie slept, breathing evenly, lightly, like a candle burning down to its final glow. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Josie looked over at Knox. He was still awake, eyes fixed on Maggie, his hand still holding hers. He didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a child sitting watch over his nanny's sleep, the way she had once sat watch over him every thunder-filled night. Near dawn, Josie realized Maggie's hand in hers was no longer squeezing. She looked down. Maggie's chest was no longer rising and falling. Her face was peaceful, her mouth still holding the faint trace of a smile. Josie placed a hand on Maggie's chest. There was no heartbeat left. She looked over at Knox. He knew too. He had known before she did, perhaps for several minutes already, but he hadn't let go of Maggie's hand. He still sat there, holding that small, cold hand, and for the first time, Josie saw tears on Knox Aldridge's face. Not many. Just one tear, sliding slowly down his cheek, falling onto Maggie's hand. He didn't wipe it away. He only sat there, holding her hand, in the quiet room, as the sky outside began to brighten. In Maggie's other hand, the one holding Josie's, was the tin box. She had pulled it into her arms at some point during the night, when neither Knox nor Josie noticed. The box was empty. The letter had been given to the right person. The secret had been spoken. The mission Maggie had carried through so many years of running, through so many nights lying on the street, through so many winters without a blanket, and so many summers without shade, that mission was complete. She had kept the secret until she found someone worthy of trust. She had lived long enough to tell the truth, and she had left in her sleep, holding the hands of the two people she loved most, on a warm bed, in the house with 12 bedrooms that she had left so many years before. Maggie Callahan didn't die as a shadow on the street. She died as a person. A few months after Maggie passed away, a 3-story white building appeared on Birch Street, with a small, neat sign above the front door bearing 2 words, Birch House, a free shelter for the homeless. Inside, there were clean beds, hot showers, a shared kitchen, and a single rule written on the wall: whoever needs it may come, and no one asks why. Knox didn't hold an opening ceremony. He didn't invite the press. He didn't put his name anywhere. He only called Tate, told him to handle everything, and Birch House opened on an ordinary Monday morning, quietly, as though it had always been there. Josie refused when Knox offered to let her manage Birch House. She said, "No, thank you. I don't work for you." She was still waiting tables at Darlene's diner, still walking to work every morning, still living in the 4th-floor apartment where the pipe had now been repaired and the curtains had been replaced. But every Thursday evening, she came to Birch House, went into the kitchen, and cooked a large meal for everyone staying there. She cooked noodles, cooked porridge, sometimes cooked soup, all simple dishes she knew how to make. And she arranged the food neatly on plates instead of leaving it in the pot, just the way Maggie had arranged that plate of noodles for her in the 4th-floor apartment that night. She cooked without pay, without a title, without anyone telling her she had to. She did it because she wanted to. One early autumn morning, Josie walked through Redmond Park on her way to the diner, the familiar road, the east gate, the narrow path between 2 rows of oak trees, the old stone benches lined up along the walkway. She passed the first bench, the second bench. Then she stopped in front of the 3rd bench from the east gate. The bench was empty. No one sat there anymore, but on the seat lay a warm loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper, heat still seeping through the paper. And beside the loaf was a small folded note tucked beneath one corner of the bread so it wouldn't blow away. Josie picked up the note, opened it, handwriting, shaky, slanted, but every stroke clear. Maggie's handwriting, for whoever needs it, and signed, M. Josie stood there, holding the note, looking at the empty stone bench. She understood. Maggie had prepared this note beforehand, maybe back when she was still sitting here every morning. Maybe she had hidden it somewhere in the park, in a place she knew Josie would find at the right time. As for the warm loaf of bread, someone had placed it here that morning. Josie didn't know who, but she didn't need to know. Maybe it was a homeless person in the park whom Maggie had once known. Maybe it was Tate under Knox's orders. Maybe it was someone Josie would never know. That didn't matter. What mattered was that the warm loaf of bread lay on the same stone bench where Maggie had once sat, with a small note saying to give it to whoever needed it. Josie held the loaf of bread. She looked around the park. A few benches away, a young man sat with his head bowed, both hands covering his face, his shoulders trembling slightly. He was crying. Josie didn't know who he was, didn't know what he was crying about, didn't know how long he had been sitting there. She didn't ask. She walked over, sat down beside him on the stone bench, tore the loaf of bread in half, placed one half on the seat between them, then took the first bite from her own piece. No words, no looking over, no question. Exactly the way she had first sat down beside Maggie. Exactly the way Maggie had taught her. That sometimes there is no need for words, only the need to sit beside someone and let them know that somebody is here. Knox Aldridge was still the most powerful man in the city. Still black suits, still black cars, still a name people spoke in whispers. But every Saturday afternoon, he came to the ice cream shop on Birch Street, sat at the small table by the window, ordered a dish of ice cream, and left the chair across from him empty. He sat there alone, eating his ice cream slowly, looking through the glass at the street outside. No one in the organization dared ask why the boss sat alone eating ice cream every Saturday afternoon. But if anyone looked closely into his eyes then, they would see that he wasn't sitting alone. He was sitting with the memory of a gray-haired old woman who had once taken a little boy to eat ice cream every Saturday afternoon, who always ordered vanilla, who always ate more slowly than the boy, and told him that ice cream had to be eaten slowly if you wanted to taste how good it was. That boy had grown up now. That nanny had gone far away. But every Saturday afternoon, the chair across from him remained empty, and the dish of vanilla ice cream on the table always came with 2 spoons. Kindness doesn't need an explanation. It doesn't need a reason. Sometimes, the strongest person isn't the one holding power in his hands, but the one brave enough to sit down beside a crying stranger and tear half a loaf of bread for him. Sometimes, what saves a human being isn't money or power, but simply the fact that someone sees them when the rest of the world walks past without stopping. And if there is anything to take from this story, it is this. Every person is carrying a burden you cannot see. One small act, one shared meal, 1 minute sitting beside someone without asking questions, may be the only thing that keeps them here when they have already wanted to let go. Be the person who stops when the whole world walks past. If this story touched you, please hit the like button and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories, because every day we bring you new stories and new emotions. How did this story make you feel? Please share with us in the comments. We always want to hear the feelings from deep within your heart, because those very shares are what motivate us to keep telling more meaningful stories. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.